Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. Let's start with a little story. So, about 2 years ago, I watched the show 100 Humans. It's a show on Netflix where three hosts slash researchers try to answer deep and profound questions like, do old people have a distinct scent? And they answer these questions by performing experiments on, wait for it, 100 humans. In one particular episode, they tried to figure out our biases around accents. What accent is most attractive or most listenable, and why? They split up 100 humans into three groups. Group 1 heard a speech about meditation and mindfulness and mental health benefits by an actor who spoke in a British accent. Group 2 heard the same speech by the same person, but this time she spoke in a Colorado accent. And Group 3 heard the speech in a Mississippi accent. After the speech, the humans gave some feedback on the presenter. Group 1 loved the speech. They found it entertaining and informative. Groups 2 and 3 found the speech boring, redundant, and even pedantic. They didn't want to be told to meditate or have good mental health. No, gross, ew, get that stuff away from them. But Group 1 loved the speech. They weren't falling asleep or yawning or rolling their eyes as people in Groups 2 and 3 were doing. No. To explain these results, the hosts brought on Nicole Holliday, my favorite linguist, and she said the following, quote, when we hear voices, they index all of this social information. Americans, for whatever reason, love British people. They think British voices sound sophisticated and authoritative. And I would be remiss if I didn't say something about this being about whiteness. Most countries in the world, the prestigious variety of accent is the one of the capital or biggest city. So what you would expect in the US is that the accent that's most prestigious is New York City or Washington, D.C. But it's not. One theory for this is that New York always had a lot of immigrants. The South, similarly, always had black people, because they enslaved a lot of black people, and so that variety was also seen as stigmatized. Particularly after they lost the Civil War, people didn't want to be associated with the losing side. So what became the prestigious norm of the US? This Midwestern thing. Why the Midwest? Nice, hard-working white people, and not that much immigration that wasn't from Europe. So, in this second episode, I wanted to look at what an accent means to someone and what it communicates about a person. I decided to interview faculty at my high school. With each interviewee, I asked the following three questions. 1. How do you define your accent and or dialect? 2. What does it mean to you to have this accent and dialect? What does it signify about you? Does it signify where you're from, who you were raised by, where you went to school, your socioeconomic status, your race? What does it mean? And 3, what sorts of privileges or limitations does your accent give you? Let's start with question 1. How do you define your accent and or dialect? Here's Mr. Robson, my former pre-calc teacher.
I would describe mine as, boringly neutral. So, obviously, coming from England, there's all sorts of influences in the language and the dialects and the accents. I grew up in the northwest, so I grew up till I was 7 in England. So I have a kind of a northern twang to certain things. Certainly my vowel sounds. So I say bath rather than bath, and fast rather than fast, like a southerner. My parents are from the northeast, and so obviously they don't have strong accents, but they influenced my accent. And then I moved when I was 7 to the Midlands. And I went to private school because my dad had a job in a private school. So there was this expectation that the offspring of the faculty would go there. And I think that influenced me a lot because it was kind of diverse background, but not near a city. It wasn't near people with lots of strong accents. So I wasn't influenced that way. So wouldn't say it's the Queen's English. It's not upper class, but I think sometimes it's perceived that way by others. So not neutral, boring English, but English, not American English.
After speaking with Mr. Robson, who again is a math teacher, I decided that STEM really wasn't the place for me as a woman. And I decided to speak to a therapist at my high school, someone trained in psychology, a counselor, someone who can really, say, hey, get it together. Women in STEM is an oxymoron. Stick to linguistics. So without further ado, Please welcome Mr. Lee.
I like to think that I don't have an accent or dialect. I think, I think this goes with um, being being a kid of immigrants who had to assimilate, and so I think my accent and my dialect is as neutral sounding as possible. Um, at least that's kind of how I think about it. I define it as not. I don't sound like someone who's English as a second language, or someone who just newly arrived to the country. Um, I don't feel like I have too many like characteristics that define like my socioeconomic. So I think of my accent and dialect more in what I'm not versus what I am.
Okay, and what are you not?
I like to think I don't sound like an Asian person who just like got to the country. Uh, I think my accent would suggest that like I'm fairly educated, grew up with some amount of privilege, where education was valued and people around me spoke good English, despite my parents not speaking English fluently. Um, I think my dialect does not suggest that like I might be too brown, too black, too ethnic. Um, so really just kind of just assimilating.
In case you didn't catch the last few words that Mr. Lee said, he said that his accent is a product of assimilation, and that he's really just assimilating when speaking. My question is, what are we assimilating into when we try to quote unquote not have an accent? If accents communicate and project so much about who we are, if they communicate what we look like, where we're from, and how much money we have, what are we trying to say to the world when we try to not have an accent? For more on this, let's go to Mrs. Hamblett.
So I grew up in New York City. I clearly do not have the sort of stereotypical New York accent. My parents were from different parts of the country. My father from the Middle States and my mother from New England. And so I think I ended up sort of a blend. My grandmother had a strong Boston accent, but that did not come down to me genetically or by upbringing. So I always felt like I didn't have an accent because I felt like I had a fairly neutral accent. I became aware of my accent in two particular parts of my life that are when I think of sort of having an accent. One is that my grandmother lived in North Carolina in a small town, and her extended family, which was large, they had the thickest accents I've ever heard, or at that point had ever heard. And I basically couldn't understand them when I was a child. And I realized they didn't talk the way I talked because I couldn't understand them at all. But I thought that was a them thing, really. Like they had these weird accents and I just had a voice. And it wasn't until I moved to England that I really became aware of myself as having an accent. And at that point, I guess I would have had to say to people that I had sort of a New England accent. But what I clearly didn't have was a British accent, which was the currency where I was. And that was the first time I really became aware of my own accent as a thing that was lacking almost again without, I almost couldn't define mine even now. I'll tell you exactly what it is. But I suppose New England, if there's an accent, but it's not the typical Maine. It's not the typical New York. It's not Boston.
This podcast brought to you by things that are always here. For example, gravity. Anyway, the next person I interviewed is actually a physicist, and so please welcome into your ears without further ado, Mrs. Jacobs, a physics teacher.
So I grew up in Southwest Nova Scotia, and so Nova Scotia, New Scotland. I wouldn't have described it this way, but when my wife first started coming to my hometown, she very much described it as like a Scottish brogue kind of situation. It's not the traditional, about thing that people think when they think Canada. The East Coast has very much like its own situation, and yeah, I think probably like Scottish Highland situation is a lot of it. But as much as it's the accent, it's also the dialect that's really strong there. And through our little community that we measure in time instead of distance, because that's just how we measure distance. For over about an hour and a half spread along this one road, there's just one highway that goes through. I think a linguist came through and said there's like 32 distinct dialects in that little small area, and we can tell kind of in a 20-minute span. I could tell if somebody's from Stony Island or Woods Harbor or Clark's Harbor or Barrington or like all these different places based on how they speak and the terms that they'll use and the little expressions that come out of those different communities. So yeah, for me, it's like a combination accent, dialect, kind of all coming together. Yeah, it's a lot of like what you might define as poor grammar. Lots of double negatives. Like we all know what we're talking about, but if an outsider were to come in, it just sounds like complete and total garble. And much like I think when you go into the depths of any community, one of my favorite places to be is actually in a bait shed down on the wharf. It's a fishing community. And when you go in there, it's like all these old guys who have like never really left the community. This is what they've done their entire lives, just fishermen. And they start talking, and I grew up there, and sometimes I'm not sure what they're talking about. It just gets so thick, and it's a lot of like words streaming into others and phrases or expressions just mashed together, like pieces of this phrase and pieces of that expression all together. And some are just like local expressions that no one else would ever understand. So yeah, it's very expressive, but very specific.
Okay. And so in talking to you now, I don't hear those double negatives, and I can understand you perfectly. So what happened there?
So when I was 18, I moved from there to college. I came to Northeastern, and for the first, I don't know, probably 4 months or so that I was on campus, nobody was listening to anything I was saying. They were only listening to how I was saying it. And our particular way of speaking is received as being less educated, less intelligent. And so it just was problematic. I didn't feel like I could ever get my point across anywhere. And so slowly over time, I just trained it out of my speech habits. And actually, my wife was asking me before, when I told her I was going to sit and chat with you, was I going to do my accent? Because she loves it. She loves coming home. She loves hearing how we all speak. She loves it. And I love it too. But I actually have a really hard time switching back on command because it was both a choice and not a choice to kind of transition out of it. This is just my American voice. And when we go up to Nova Scotia, we take a ferry when we go, and like partway through the ferry, this American accent will completely melt away and my home accent will completely come out. So she says out is the only word I still can't quite get in full American. But I think unless you're listening for it, it's hard to pick up on. So yeah, it just wasn't working. So I got rid of it.
For emphasis, I want to restate the last few words Mrs. Jacobs said. She said that her accent wasn't working. And so she got rid of it, just like that. By changing her accent, Mrs. Jacobs attained a higher level of privilege. And now, it's difficult to slip back into her Nova Scotian accent when she's not actually in Nova Scotia. Her story speaks to accent's uniqueness. We have autonomy over the way we speak. We can't control our race or our ethnicity, but we can manipulate our accent to benefit us. Perhaps that is why Mrs. Jacobs switches back into her Nova Scotian accent when she's in Nova Scotia, because it's a beneficial choice. To hear more about accents and how they shift depending on where we are, let's go to Miss Bell.
So I would define my English accent as Bostonian, or at least Southwest Massachusetts, or Southeast Massachusetts accent. I've noticed, at least when speaking to my peers and particularly friends in college, that my accent tends to come out a lot thicker when I'm very emotional. So if I'm excited about something, or I'm, aggravated or playing video games, I tend to take on that thicker Bostonian accent where I start dropping my R's and a lot of my A's becomes like ah. So like I'll be like, oh my God, or like pack your car, pack the car. So things like that. And I will admit, I've lived in the Boston area for basically my whole life. So it's not something I particularly noticed until more I went to college and people commented on it. I've also noticed that dialectually, in terms of dialect, there are things that, like I say that still fit in with the vocabulary that people around here use, but not necessarily what people from other areas. Like I would call the thing that you drink from in a hallway a water fountain, though some people insist that it's a bubbler. And I did take linguistics, and one thing that we were cautioned about was using descriptivist view rather than a prescriptivist view, so that we listen to what others are saying rather than saying, this is the accent that you have, I'm prescribing it.
After speaking with Miss Bell and learning those very important linguistical terms, I went to Mr. Connolly, my former Spanish teacher.
Natively, I have a Boston accent. I grew up in Medford, Massachusetts, and it sort of comes and goes. The joke that my wife likes to make is that if I spend time with my family, my cousins especially, it will come on pretty strong and last a few days, where professionally, whether consciously or unconsciously, I think I've tamped it down. And that's something that I've thought about as a resident of Boston at a school in Greater Boston, how much of that accent do I use personally, and how much of it do we hear around? I'm also conscious of, as a language teacher and as a non-native Spanish teacher, what are the accents that I use and that stick and that I project?
After all those interviews, which I'm sure were enlightening and fascinating and entertaining, I really only had one last place to go. And that was to the office of my speech coach, Miss JB. And as per usual, she was accompanied by another fantastic human. I think fantastic humans usually attract other fantastic humans. So when I walked into her office, there sat Dr. Funes, a Spanish teacher, and I said, what an opportunity. What an opportunity to interview two people at once. And so here it is, folks, my interview with Dr. Funes and Miss JB.
So that's interesting. I immediately thought, just as Miss JB said, I don't have an accent. So I was raised in Argentina and then moved to the Midwest, to Peoria, Illinois, mid-central Illinois, as a 12-year-old. So I think that my accent in English is classic Midwestern. And so it seems kind of boring, right? It's middle of the road. It's literally middle of the road. So I can do any accent I want to, because right now I speak English as I do, as my dad did, or anyone else in my family. But I could have imitated any accent. I learned by imitating people, by going to the mall, and remember? We'd go to the mall and imitate people. That wasn't part of the question, but
that's so cool. So I
think it's a lack of accent, but people in the South would be like, why y'all talk funny?
Well, interestingly, people ask me why I don't have an accent.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's funny.
They often say, you're not from Boston. You don't have an accent. And I say, what does that mean?
What does it mean?
So perhaps I don't have the Boston accent.
Boston.
Right, that. But I do know about accents through my mother. So my mother is a director of research at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, nursing research. And she has, for 30 years, struggled with so much discrimination because of her accent. So much so that to this day, if she mispronounces something, I am very cautious about helping her pronounce it correctly, because it is perceived as an insult, as a lack of intelligence. So I avoid that like the plague. And her only stories that she brings home that are negative about work are people correcting her.
Oh, so that leads to the other question. So your perceived lack of accent, my perceived lack of accent, has been shaped by socioeconomic status.
For sure.
You've grown up in a medical, scientific family. Same with myself. So I'm a child of immigrants. My parents, my father is Argentinian. My mother's also Argentinian. He's very dark. She's very white, but he never wanted to have any markers of being Hispanic or Latino.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. So he said, even though he talked like this, he was always like, you are American and now, and this is where you live and this is who you are. And he did not want to have anyone calling attention to himself.
Wow. And
Yeah. Didn't want to be perceived.
my mother would often say, and still says, you can do anything. You speak this language.
That's interesting.
You have the language. You can now, and she says it all the time. She's like, you can switch careers and go be a doctor. You can be a professor. You have the language.
It's linguistic.
And that is the thing that she felt was her biggest hurdle.
Thanks so much for listening to Tomato Tomato. On our next episode, you'll hear from my interviewees as they answer the second question I asked. See you then.